You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 5, Redshift. Part 1, Stars Above, Shadows Below. The clearing in the woods always felt like a secret place. Towering pines stood sentinel on every side, their dark silhouettes carved against a dome of stars so vast it seemed endless. Lucy Rollins, 14, stretched out on a patchy wool blanket. The damp earth pressed up through the thin fabric, grounding her in a world she found far less interesting than the one twinkling above. Matt, her younger brother by 2 years, was perched beside her, one knee drawn up as he absently swiped at a buzzing mosquito. "You brought that?" he asked, his tone a mix of mockery and fondness as he nodded toward the notebook cradled in Lucy's lap. Lucy didn't look up, scribbling a note beside her crude diagram of Orion's belt. "Of course I brought it. I'm not going to just sit here and forget everything by morning." She flipped to another page, its edges warped from being thumbed through countless times, and frowned. The world needs this stuff written down. What if no one else notices something new? Matt rolled his eyes and flopped back onto the blanket, his arms stretched wide as if he could embrace the whole sky. "You're such a nerd. You're supposed to just look, you know? Feel it. Don't dissect it." Lucy smirked, shaking her head. "That's the difference between you and me, Matt. You're here for the magic. I'm here for the truth." The night air was thick with summer's humidity, and the scent of pine sap mingled with the faint sweetness of nearby wildflowers. Crickets chirped in a rhythmic hum, their song punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind stirred. Above, the stars burned with an almost hypnotic steadiness, their light so ancient it felt like gazing into a time machine. It was Matt who first noticed something was off. He sat up suddenly, his brows furrowed as he peered past the tops of the trees. "What's that?" he murmured, more to himself than to Lucy. Lucy glanced at him, then followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the stars, a blur of infinite pinpricks against the velvety black. But then, there it was. A point of light, faint and golden, moving with a deliberate steadiness that no plane or shooting star could mimic. "It's probably a satellite," she said automatically, though her fingers paused mid-note. Matt was already on his feet, his lanky frame silhouetted against the glow. The light grew brighter, its golden hue shifting to a silvery white that bathed the clearing in an otherworldly glow. "Lucy, look at that." His voice held an urgency that cut through her skepticism. She stood, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. The light didn't just grow, it descended, casting elongated shadows of the trees around them. The crickets went silent, as if nature itself held its breath. "Matt, don't." But he was already moving, his bare feet crunching through the underbrush as he stepped toward the light. It wasn't frantic, like someone running, but purposeful, as if he were being drawn by a force unseen. "Matt, stop!" Lucy's voice cracked, her fear mounting as she watched his figure shrink against the approaching brightness. The light enveloped him, and for a brief moment, it was as though the clearing itself had ceased to exist. Every detail dissolved into a blaze of brilliance so intense Lucy had to shield her eyes. The last thing she saw before the light consumed everything was Matt, standing still, his arms at his sides, staring up as if he'd found the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Then, just as suddenly, the light was gone. The clearing plunged back into darkness, the stars above feeling cold and distant now, indifferent to her terror. "Matt!" Lucy's voice was a raw cry that echoed off the trees. She stumbled forward, her feet catching on roots and rocks as she reached the spot where her brother had been standing. The grass there was untouched, unmarked by anything that could explain what had just happened. "Matt!" she screamed again, her voice splintering into sobs. Her knees hit the ground, and she clawed at the earth as if digging would somehow bring him back. The notebook fell forgotten beside her, its pages fluttering in the faint breeze. The night pressed in around her, heavier now without Matt's presence. Every shadow seemed to stretch closer, and the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. The search parties came quickly enough, summoned by Lucy's frantic run back to the house. She burst through the front door, her words a jumbled mess of light and stars, and Matt's name. Her parents were the first to react. Her mother froze, her face pale and stricken, while her father grabbed a flashlight and bolted for the woods without asking a single question. The neighbors joined within the hour, and soon the clearing was awash with beams of light cutting through the darkness. But there was no trace of Matt. Lucy tried to explain what had happened. She described the light in painstaking detail, every flicker and shift of color etched into her memory with painful clarity. But her words were met with skepticism and thinly veiled pity. The sheriff, a man with kind eyes and a voice thick with southern drawl, crouched in front of her as she sat on the porch steps, her knees drawn to her chest. "Now, Lucy," he said gently, "sometimes when we're scared, our minds play tricks on us. You've had a shock tonight, and that's normal. But we'll find Matt. Don't you worry." She wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to demand he listen. But she was tired, her voice hoarse from hours of yelling, and the weight of disbelief crushed her. By dawn, the search party thinned, and Lucy was left staring at the forest from her bedroom window. The clearing, her once favorite place, was now a void, a reminder of something taken. Her mother brought tea she didn't drink. Her father paced so much the floorboards creaked under his weight. And Lucy sat, staring out at the horizon where the stars had faded, her mind replaying the moment over and over. Matt was gone, and no one believed her. The following weeks were a blur of whispered conversations behind closed doors and carefully worded questions from strangers. Lucy overheard things she wasn't supposed to. Words like trauma and grief response and unreliable witness. She stayed quiet, refusing to speak unless pressed, because what was the point? Her notebook, once her prized possession, remained on the nightstand, untouched. The constellations she'd carefully mapped out seemed meaningless now. The stars hadn't answered her. They had taken. One night, unable to sleep, Lucy crept back to the clearing. She stood in the same spot where Matt had disappeared, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the night's chill. "Where are you?" she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Above her, the stars twinkled on, their ancient light a cruel reminder of the vastness of everything. Lucy clenched her fists and turned away, walking back toward the house. She didn't know how, but she swore she would find him, no matter how long it took. Part 2. Cosmic Determination. The apartment was small, more like a capsule built for function than comfort, but Lucy Rollins had made it her sanctuary. Every surface, from the walls to the bookshelves that bowed under the weight of too many texts, whispered of her obsessions. The left side of the room was dominated by heavy tomes on astrophysics and cosmology, their spines cracked with use. To the right, a scattered array of books on ancient astronaut theories leaned precariously, their vibrant covers and bold fonts a jarring contrast to the stoic seriousness of the scientific journals. Pinned above her desk was a faded map of the night sky, its edges curling, punctuated by penciled annotations that had grown more frantic over the years. A battered notebook sat in the middle of the desk, its cover worn thin, as though it had absorbed every frantic thought Lucy had poured into it since that night in the clearing. Beside it, a cold cup of tea sat forgotten. Lucy sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of papers and printouts, their edges worn from her hands. She was barefoot, her jeans frayed at the cuffs, and she wore an oversized sweatshirt that hung loosely around her narrow shoulders. Her hair, always in a rush to escape the bun she'd hastily tied it into, framed her face in a messy halo. Her eyes landed on an old photograph taped to the edge of her desk lamp. Two children, arms slung around each other's shoulders, beamed at the camera. Lucy reached out and touched the photo's edge, her fingertips ghosting over her brother's boyish grin. "I haven't forgotten," she murmured, her voice thick, resonating with a quiet resolve that carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. "I never will." The moment lingered before she forced herself back to work. The past could not be undone, but she'd spent 2 decades chasing answers to make sense of it. Answers, she believed, that the stars held if she only looked hard enough. That night, Lucy was at the observatory again, a place she often rented with money she should have been saving. The air smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant, and the hum of machinery filled the silence. She adjusted the controls of the telescope with the precision of a surgeon. Outside the wide dome overhead, The sky glittered in a display that still managed to take her breath away, no matter how many nights she had spent looking up. Her work as an astronomer at a prominent research institution was celebrated, at least professionally. Privately, her colleagues often exchanged polite but dismissive glances when her enthusiasm for alternative theories slipped into conversation. She could sense it in their voices during meetings, the way they would clear their throats or redirect the discussion when she referenced the possibility of extraterrestrial influence on human history. Lucy didn't care. She had long since learned to let their skepticism roll off her like water against stone. They didn't know. They hadn't seen. Still, the loneliness of it stung. Her reflection caught in the glass of the telescope's controls, and she paused. The woman staring back at her looked older than her 29 years. The hollows under her eyes spoke of nights spent sifting through data until her vision blurred. But her gaze was steady, fierce even, with a determination that hadn't wavered since she was 14. "Time's running out, Matt," she muttered to the empty room, her tone edged with urgency. "But I'll find you." The words hung there, filling the space with a quiet tension. She hadn't spoken her brother's name aloud in weeks, not even to herself. It was easier that way. But tonight, the ache in her chest felt particularly sharp, a reminder of the time slipping through her fingers. When she wasn't at the observatory or her job, Lucy could often be found in dimly lit conference rooms or community centers, sitting among the believers. The gatherings were eclectic, filled with people who clutched onto the same fragments of hope and conspiracy that had drawn her in. Some came with wild stories, others with evidence they swore would change everything. Lucy listened, her notebook always open, though she rarely contributed. "You're Lucy Rollins, right?" someone asked one evening, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and a notebook even more battered than hers. His voice was scratchy, almost like gravel shifting underfoot. She looked up from her notes, startled. "Yes. I've read your papers. You're a real scientist." He chuckled, the sound carrying a mix of admiration and disbelief. "What's someone like you doing at a place like this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she considered not answering. But then, her gaze drifted toward the stage where a speaker was passionately describing an encounter with lights in the woods. "I'm looking for something," she said finally, her tone measured but distant, as though the words themselves were a fragile thread she didn't want to tug too hard. "Aren't we all?" the man replied, and though the conversation moved on, Lucy felt the truth of his statement settle over her like a weight. Balancing her professional life with her personal mission was a tightrope act Lucy had never quite perfected. Her coworkers often invited her to after-work drinks or casual gatherings, but she rarely attended. On the rare occasion she did, she spent most of the time on the fringes, politely smiling at jokes she didn't find funny. Once, during a team dinner, a colleague brought up her reputation. "You're the alien lady, right?" he said, his tone light but cutting. He wore the smug expression of someone who thought they were being clever. "You think the pyramids were landing pads or something?" The table erupted in polite laughter, but Lucy's expression didn't waver. She placed her fork down carefully, her hand steady despite the fire building in her chest. "I think," she said evenly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise, "that the universe is vast enough to hold more mysteries than our egos are willing to admit." The laughter died down, and the conversation shifted, but the tension lingered. Lucy excused herself soon after and walked home under a sky that felt more judgmental than welcoming that night. One evening, back in her apartment, Lucy found herself staring at the map pinned to the wall. Her finger traced the path of a comet she'd tracked years ago, her mind drifting back to the countless hours spent chasing celestial objects, hoping they'd lead her closer to answers. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from a colleague. "Nice presentation today. Have you thought about publishing something on that other stuff you're into?" She closed the message without replying. She didn't need their approval or their condescension. Her work wasn't for them. It was for Matt. For herself. For the truth. Lucy leaned back in her chair, staring at the map until her eyes burned. Her resolve solidified like steel under pressure. "Just a little longer," she whispered, her voice resolute tinged with the faintest hint of desperation. "I'm getting closer." The stars outside her window seemed to blink in silent acknowledgement, their ancient light both a comfort and a reminder of how far she still had to go. Part 3. The Wavelength Paradox. The observatory hummed faintly, its electronic lifeblood coursing through wires hidden in the walls. Lucy Rollins leaned over a monitor, her fingers poised above the keyboard, though she hadn't typed anything in several minutes. She was staring at a set of spectral data that refused to make sense. Outside the thick glass of the observatory dome, the stars hung indifferent, like silent witnesses to her mounting frustration. The data was crisp, captured from galaxies so distant their light had traveled billions of years to reach her instruments. Each dataset told the same story, or at least, it was supposed to. The wavelengths stretched predictably in accordance with the universe's alleged expansion. But as she traced the redshift patterns for the fourth time that night, something prickled at the edge of her consciousness. There was an inconsistency, subtle but persistent, as though the data itself were whispering that she was looking at it all wrong. Lucy's breath stilled, her focus tightening like a camera lens. She shifted in her chair, the motion sharp with purpose, and began cross-referencing older datasets she'd saved from previous sessions. The chair creaked under her weight as she leaned in closer, squinting at the faint curves and spikes of the spectral lines. "Come on," she muttered, her voice quiet but charged, her tone low and deliberate as if coaxing a reluctant witness to reveal the truth. "Show me what I'm missing." Her fingers finally moved, pulling up a comparison graph that layered the old data with the new. She adjusted the scale, zooming in so far the lines blurred, then recalibrated. As the details snapped into focus, her heart skipped. There it was again. An anomaly in the intensity of light from these galaxies, a pattern that deviated just enough from the expansion model to be suspicious. Lucy sat back slowly, her pulse pounding. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, as if her discovery had shifted the gravitational pull around her. She reached for a pen and her notebook, scribbling equations that branched out like nervous, frantic vines. Numbers spilled from her thoughts onto the page, connecting the dots of her realization. The idea had been a quiet murmur in her mind for years, dismissed as a fanciful curiosity. But tonight, it grew louder, insistent. What if the redshift wasn't caused by the stretching of space, but by something more intrinsic? What if photons lost energy as they traveled, like runners slowing over long distances? The thought was exhilarating and dangerous. It challenged everything. Lucy knew she couldn't simply write this off as an artifact of error. If her calculations were correct, the implications were monumental. But monumental ideas required monumental evidence. And so, she began to draft the framework for a series of tests. The first test focused on the most direct metric: energy loss of light over distance. Lucy's hypothesis proposed that photons themselves might decay, bleeding energy into the void as they traveled through space. The current model accounted for brightness changes with distance, but what if it was incomplete? If photons decayed, their energy loss would leave behind a faint but detectable signature, a mismatch between redshift and luminosity that couldn't be explained by cosmic dust or other mundane factors. She made a note. Isolate high-resolution spectra of galaxies at different distances. Compare energy profiles. Control for environmental interference. The second test was trickier. Time dilation in supernovae light curves. Type Ia supernovae, the so-called standard candles of cosmology, were used to measure the universe's expansion rate. Their light curves stretched with redshift, a phenomenon attributed to time dilation caused by the expansion of space. But what if that wasn't the full story? If photons decayed rather than being stretched, the time dilation effect might manifest differently, or not at all. Lucy leaned back, her pen tapping against her lower lip as she thought. This test would require cooperation from a telescope capable of capturing supernovae in various stages of their light curves. She scribbled another note. Gather archival supernovae data. Look for deviations in duration versus redshift correlation. Her third and most ambitious test involved the cosmic microwave background CMB. The CMB was the universe's ancient echo, its photons stretched so far into the microwave spectrum they could no longer be seen. These photons were key to proving the universe's expansion, But if they had decayed instead of stretching, the CMB's spectral signature might carry subtle distortions. Lucy paused, the pen hovering above her notebook. This test would be the hardest to pull off. It required data from missions like Planck or WMAP and advanced modeling to isolate photon decay signatures. But if she could find even a hint of distortion, it would shake the foundations of modern cosmology. "Examine spectral uniformity for irregularities," she wrote, her hand pressing harder into the paper than she realized. Hours passed as she refined her plans. The glow of the monitor painted her face in pale, flickering light, accentuating the hollows under her eyes and the tightness in her jawline. Every so often, she glanced at the photograph of Matt taped to the edge of her desk lamp. His grin, forever frozen in time, was both a comfort and a reminder of what drove her. By the time Lucy stood and stretched, her muscles stiff from being hunched over her desk, the horizon outside the observatory's window was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Her legs protested as she paced the room, the movement shaking loose some of the tension coiled inside her. As she poured herself a mug of coffee from the thermos she'd brought, her mind drifted to Matt. Solving this puzzle wasn't just about understanding the universe. It was about finding him. Somehow, she knew the answers were connected. If the cosmos could take him, surely it could also reveal where he had gone. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if to dismiss the thought. It wasn't the first time she'd made that leap, and she hated herself a little for it. Science wasn't about emotion. It was about facts, data, precision. And yet, the two were intertwined for her in ways she couldn't separate, no matter how hard she tried. Her first findings came 3 weeks later, after countless nights spent analyzing archived data and requesting time on telescopes more powerful than the one at her disposal. The preliminary results were thrilling and terrifying. There were faint but consistent indications of energy loss in light from the most distant galaxies, a pattern that aligned too neatly with her hypothesis to ignore. Lucy stared at the graph on her screen, her heart pounding. The realization hit her like a gust of wind, cold and bracing. She might be onto something that changed everything. Her colleagues wouldn't believe her, not yet. They would dismiss her as they always had, citing human error or the impossibility of overturning decades of consensus. She could already hear the cutting remarks, the dismissive tones. But she didn't care. The truth wasn't about being believed. It was about finding it. She closed her notebook and stood by the window, staring out at the fading stars. Her voice, when it came, was soft and steady, tinged with an undercurrent of quiet defiance. "Matt," she said, her tone carrying a promise only she could hear, "I think I'm getting closer." Above, the morning sky began to bloom, streaks of pale pink and gold washing away the darkness. The universe, vast and infinite, remained silent. But Lucy had never been one to let silence deter her. Part 4. Shadows in the Observatory. The conference room was more modest than Lucy had expected, faded carpet, scuffed walls, and a projector screen that rippled faintly at the edges. A dozen faces turned to her as she entered, their expressions ranging from cautious interest to outright skepticism. It wasn't the prestigious crowd she had once envisioned for her work, but these were the people who would listen. In the end, that was all that mattered. Lucy adjusted the strap of her laptop bag and walked to the front of the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow that seemed to drain the warmth from the space. She placed her materials on the rickety podium and took a steadying breath, her fingers brushing the edges of her notebook. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice level but edged with restrained intensity. "What I'm about to share is still in its early stages, but I believe it has the potential to reshape our understanding of the universe." A few heads tilted, curious. Others remained impassive, arms crossed, waiting for the punchline. Lucy's stomach tightened, but she pushed forward, pulling up her first slide, a series of spectral graphs, their lines highlighted in red. "These are observations of distant galaxies," she explained, gesturing toward the screen. Her voice grew firmer, laced with a quiet authority that demanded attention. "The data shows anomalies in the redshift patterns, subtle but consistent. They suggest that the loss of photon energy over vast distances could account for the observed redshift, rather than the expansion of space." A murmur rippled through the room, low and skeptical. Lucy scanned the faces, noting the furrowed brows and skeptical glances exchanged. She anticipated this. It was the reaction of people who had spent their lives tethered to a single paradigm. One man, older with a deeply lined face, raised his hand. "So, you're saying the universe isn't expanding?" His tone was measured, but there was a sharpness to it, a challenge. "I'm saying it's possible that redshift doesn't require expansion to explain it," Lucy replied. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers gripped the edge of the podium as she spoke. "If photons lose energy as they travel, whether through decay, interaction, or another mechanism we haven't identified, it could account for the observations we currently attribute to expansion." A woman near the back spoke next, her voice cool but pointed. "That's a bold claim. What about the cosmic microwave background? The time dilation in supernovae light curves?" Lucy anticipated this too. "I've begun exploring those aspects," she said, tapping to her next slide, which outlined her proposed tests. "My early findings align with the hypothesis, but it will take time to gather more conclusive evidence." The murmurs grew louder. She could feel the skepticism thickening in the air, pressing against her like an invisible weight. But not everyone was dismissive. A man in a well-worn jacket leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "What you're describing, it's not unlike what some of us have theorized about interstellar phenomena," he said, his voice softer, as though inviting her to elaborate. Lucy nodded, her shoulders easing slightly. "I believe the implications extend beyond cosmology. If we understand this process, it could open doors we haven't even considered." A flicker of agreement passed through the room, but it was fleeting. As the discussion wound down, Lucy packed her materials, keenly aware of the mixed reception. Some had taken notes, others had dismissed her entirely. The skeptics lingered in her mind, their skepticism like a stubborn residue she couldn't scrub away. Later that night, the observatory was quiet, save for the faint hum of machinery. Lucy sat at her desk, her notes spread out like pieces of a puzzle. The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of her monitor. Outside, the sky stretched vast and unyielding, the stars cold pinpricks in an endless void. Her focus was so absolute she almost missed the sound. A faint click, like the shuffle of a door being pushed shut. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. The main door to the observatory was ajar, a thin line of moonlight spilling into the darkened corridor beyond. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady but probing, edged with a caution she couldn't quite suppress. No answer. Lucy's pulse quickened as she stood, her movements deliberate. She stepped into the hallway, her shoes tapping softly against the linoleum floor. The air felt heavier here, as though it carried something unseen. She scanned the empty corridor, her gaze sweeping over the rows of offices and storage rooms. There was no one. When she returned to her desk, her notebook was gone. The first warning came the following morning. A small envelope had been placed on her desk, its edges sharp against the clutter of papers. Lucy stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, her fingers brushing the coarse paper. There was no address, no name, just a single sheet of paper inside. "Stop now." The message was typed, devoid of personality or context. It might have been laughable if not for the weight of the missing notebook, the ajar door, the sensation of being watched that she couldn't shake. Lucy crumpled the note in her hand, her jaw tightening. A part of her wanted to dismiss it as a prank or a coincidence, but the unease gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. Over the next week, the strange occurrences multiplied. Data she had saved meticulously vanished from her computer, entire folders wiped clean. A pair of men in dark suits appeared at the observatory one afternoon, claiming to be inspectors from a funding agency. They asked vague questions about her research, their eyes lingering too long on her monitor, their expressions inscrutable. When she asked for credentials, they deflected, offering clipped reassurances before leaving abruptly. That night, Lucy triple-checked the locks on the observatory doors. The more the interference escalated, the more Lucy's resolve hardened. If someone, or something, was trying to stop her, it only confirmed the significance of her work. Her frustration morphed into a fierce determination, her movements sharp with purpose as she backed up her data onto external drives, kept her notes under lock and key, and began working odd hours to avoid predictable routines. But even as she fought to protect her research, the weight of it all pressed against her. The isolation she had grown accustomed to now felt stifling. The observatory, once her sanctuary, seemed to breathe against her, its walls whispering secrets she couldn't quite catch. One night, as she stared at the missing data logs on her computer screen, a quiet desperation crept into her voice. "Who are you?" she murmured, her tone low, steady, but tinged with a rising defiance. "What are you so afraid of?" The room offered no answer, only the faint hum of the cooling fan and the distant call of a night owl outside. Lucy's determination was afire now, crackling and consuming. She began running her tests at a frantic pace, poring over every scrap of salvaged data as though the answers were just beyond her reach. When exhaustion crept in, she pushed it aside, her mind replaying the same mantra. "Matt is still out there. I can find him." One evening, while reviewing her spectral analysis, she paused, her breath catching. Amid the graphs and numbers, she saw a pattern she hadn't noticed before, a faint but deliberate line of interference that didn't match any known anomaly. Her voice, when she spoke, was a mix of disbelief and quiet determination. "You're leaving fingerprints," she said aloud, as though addressing whatever force had been working against her. "And I'll find them." Above her, the stars blinked on in silent affirmation, as though they too were waiting to see what she would uncover. Part 5. Contact from the Stars. The observatory was bathed in the cold glow of its instruments, the gentle hum of machinery and occasional click of data logs, the only sounds in the vast, empty space. Lucy sat at her workstation, her posture tense with focus as she analyzed the latest results. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the stars pinpricks of light against the ink-black canvas. Her hand hovered over her keyboard, hesitating as her eyes caught an odd spike in the data. She leaned closer to the monitor, her pulse quickening. The pattern was familiar yet foreign, like a fragment of a forgotten melody. She made a note in her journal, her pen pressing deeply into the page. "Why do you keep showing up?" she whispered to herself, her voice carrying an edge of both frustration and curiosity. She reached for her cup of coffee, now cold, and took a sip without flinching, her gaze never leaving the screen. The air felt different tonight. Thicker. Heavier. Lucy paused, turning her head toward the observatory dome, her instincts prickling with unease. She pushed back from her desk and stood, her movements careful, deliberate. The silence was palpable now, pressing against her ears as if the entire room were holding its breath. Then it began. A soft golden light appeared outside the dome, faint at first but growing rapidly in intensity. Lucy's chest tightened as she stepped toward the observation window, shielding her eyes with one hand. The light wasn't like the familiar glow of a celestial event. It pulsed, alive with an otherworldly energy that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "No," she breathed, her voice low, laced with disbelief. She took another step toward the window, her body moving almost involuntarily. The light expanded, spilling into the observatory like liquid gold, consuming everything in its path. The last thing she felt was the sensation of weightlessness, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Lucy awoke to a sterile brightness that stung her eyes. She blinked rapidly, her surroundings swimming into focus. The room was unlike anything she had ever seen. Smooth metallic walls with no visible seams, the air humming faintly with an energy she couldn't place. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, diffused in a way that felt unnatural. She was lying on a flat surface that molded to her shape, neither warm nor cold. Her body felt strangely light, as though gravity had loosened its grip. When she sat up, her movements were sluggish, as if she were moving through water. A sound broke the silence, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Lucy turned her head sharply, her breath catching as she saw them. They weren't human. The figures stood tall and slender, their forms encased in a silvery material that shimmered like liquid mercury. Their faces were smooth, featureless, save for two dark, elongated eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. They regarded her with a stillness that was unnerving, their movements slow, deliberate as they approached. "Lucy Rollins," one of them spoke, the voice resonating in her mind rather than her ears. It was calm yet commanding, carrying a weight of authority that made her spine stiffen. The tone was smooth, measured, and eerily devoid of emotion, as though the words themselves were more concept than sound. Lucy's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat felt dry, her mind reeling with questions that tangled together into incoherence. "You are reckless," the voice continued, the statement as sharp and precise as a scalpel. "Your pursuit endangers not only your world, but others beyond." Her hands curled into fists at her sides, and she forced herself to meet their gaze, or what she assumed was their gaze. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with defiance. "What do you mean in danger?" The figure tilted its head slightly, an almost curious gesture. "Your species lacks the understanding to wield what you seek. Photon decay, as you call it, is not merely a scientific curiosity. It is a doorway." Lucy's breath hitched. "A doorway to what?" "To realms beyond your comprehension," the voice replied, its tone unyielding, final. "Your discovery, if left unchecked, would lead to chaos, a reckless species tearing through the fabric of the cosmos." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to destroy anything," she said, her voice rising slightly, a mix of anger and desperation. "I'm trying to understand, to find answers. My work isn't about power or conquest." The figure moved closer, its presence both imposing and surreal. "Your intentions are irrelevant. The consequences remain the same." Lucy took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt small, insignificant under their gaze, but the fire in her wouldn't allow her to shrink away. "You're talking about consequences, but you're the ones interfering. My work, it's not just science. It's personal. You don't understand what's at stake for me." There was a pause, a stillness that stretched unbearably, before the voice responded. "Your brother." Lucy's stomach dropped. The words struck her like a physical blow, her breath catching as she stared at them. "What do you know about Matt?" she demanded, her tone raw, trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "We know what you seek," the figure replied, "and we know where he is." The room seemed to tilt around her, her vision narrowing as the implications of their words sank in. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out as though she could physically grasp the answers she so desperately needed. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice breaking, filled with an urgency that bordered on desperation. "Is he alive? Is he safe?" The figure didn't move, its voice unchanging. "He lives, but his return comes with conditions." Lucy's hands fell to her sides, trembling. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground crumbling beneath her. "What conditions?" she asked, her voice quieter now, her tone a fragile thread holding her together. The figure stepped back, its form shimmering faintly as the light around it shifted. "You must stop. Your pursuit ends here." Lucy shook her head, her fists clenching. "You're asking me to abandon everything. My work, my purpose, all of it. For what? You expect me to trust you?" The room grew silent again, the weight of their gaze pressing down on her. "Your trust is irrelevant. The choice is yours." Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mind raced, every fiber of her being screaming at her to resist, to push back. But the mention of Matt was a hook she couldn't free herself from. "Prove it," she said finally, her voice steady but brittle, like a blade on the verge of snapping. "Prove he's alive." The figure tilted its head again, the faint hum in the air growing louder. "In time." Before she could respond, the light flared again, brighter than before, swallowing her in an instant. Lucy found herself on the floor of the observatory, the cold tiles pressing against her palms. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed herself up slowly, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room was exactly as it had been before the light appeared. Her equipment blinked steadily, her notes untouched, but she felt it, the lingering presence, the undeniable truth of their words. She looked up at the dome above her, the stars beyond it distant and indifferent. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but resolute, carrying an edge of defiance. "You might know where Matt is," she said, her tone firm, "but you don't know me." Above, the constellations shimmered on, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the war brewing inside her. Part 6. A Bargain with the Beyond. Lucy stood in the center of the observatory, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she could anchor herself to the moment. The air around her seemed charged, humming with a presence that was both oppressive and surreal. The aliens had returned and not spoken for several minutes, their stillness unnerving in its absolute lack of humanity. She felt their eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, watching her, waiting. Their words still echoed in her mind. "Halt your work, and we will return him to you." She had spent her entire life chasing the truth, driven by a need that had become indistinguishable from her own identity. Now they were asking her to let it all go, to abandon everything she had worked for. Her pulse quickened as her gaze darted between the aliens, their shimmering forms flickering faintly in the lightless room. The air pressed down on her like a storm about to break. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked, her voice sharp, each word weighted with suspicion and pain. She didn't bother masking her anger. It spilled into her tone like a wave cresting after being held back too long. "We do not require your trust," the alien closest to her said, its voice resonating in her mind with an eerie calm. "We require your compliance." Lucy took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching out to the desk behind her as though it could provide support. "That's not an answer. You could be lying. You could promise me the world and leave me with nothing." There was a silence that stretched far too long, the kind that made the walls feel like they were closing in. Finally, the alien spoke again, its tone unchanging, devoid of anything that resembled empathy. "We do not lie. Your brother will be returned. In 3 of your Earth weeks, he will stand before you." Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. The words hit her with the weight of a promise she couldn't afford to believe, yet couldn't dismiss. Matthew. The image of his face, young, full of life, flashed in her mind, accompanied by the hollow ache of loss that had defined her for so long. "And my work?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with a defiance that hadn't fully left her. "What happens if I stop? What happens to everything I've uncovered?" The alien's response was immediate. "It will remain as it is, undisturbed. But if you continue, the consequences will not be contained to your world." Lucy's fingers curled against the edge of the desk, the cool surface grounding her in the swirl of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. She searched their expressionless forms for something, anything, that would help her understand the depth of their warning. But there was nothing. Only the stark, unyielding reality of the choice they had placed before her. "I need time to think," she said finally, the words slipping out before she could second-guess them. Her voice carried an edge of determination, as if giving herself a sliver of control in a situation that felt entirely beyond her grasp. "There is no time," the alien said. "Your decision must be made now." Lucy's breath caught, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Her chest rose and fell as she fought to steady herself, to block out the noise in her head long enough to think clearly. She closed her eyes, the image of Matt's face swimming back to her. She thought of his laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he teased her about her stargazing obsession. She thought of the years she had spent trying to bring him back, trying to fill the void he had left behind. When she opened her eyes, they burned with unshed tears. "Fine," she said, her voice low, the words carrying a quiet intensity that felt like they had been ripped from her. "I'll stop. But if you don't bring him back—" She paused, her throat tightening as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "If you don't, I'll find another way. And I won't stop." The alien tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost mechanical. "We will fulfill our promise. You must fulfill yours." The weeks that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Lucy submitted her leave of absence to the university with a hastily written email, her explanation vague enough to avoid questions but firm enough to prevent follow-up. She told no one about the agreement, locking the memory of her encounter in a place so deep it felt like a wound she couldn't touch. Her days stretched endlessly, unmoored from the routine that had once defined her life. The observatory remained dark, her equipment untouched, her notes sealed away in a drawer she refused to open. The silence in her apartment was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator or the distant sounds of the city outside her window. She tried to distract herself, reading books she couldn't focus on, watching documentaries that only reminded her of what she had left behind. But nothing could quiet the storm of doubt that churned inside her. What if they were lying? What if she had thrown away everything for a promise they had no intention of keeping? The thought gnawed at her, its sharp edges cutting deeper with each passing day. She found herself pacing her apartment late at night, her bare feet padding against the cool floor as she replayed the conversation in her mind. She analyzed every word, every pause, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue she had missed. Her emotions swung wildly, one moment filled with cautious hope, the next consumed by anger and regret. She caught herself staring at the photograph of Matt on her desk, her fingers tracing the edges as if the act could tether her to the memory of him. The third night, Lucy sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. She let out a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke aloud to the empty room. What if I made a mistake? Her words hung in the air, unanswered, the silence pressing against her like a weight she couldn't lift. She thought of the equations she hadn't finished, the data she hadn't analyzed, the questions she had left unanswered. It felt like cutting away a part of herself, leaving a gaping wound where her work had once been. But then she thought of Matt, his face, his voice, the sound of his laughter. The thought steadied her, pulling her back from the edge of despair. She straightened, her movements deliberate, and stood. She walked to the window and stared out at the night sky, her eyes scanning the stars as if searching for something she couldn't name. 3 weeks, she murmured, her voice quiet but resolute. I'll wait 3 weeks. The days passed slowly, each one dragging as Lucy forced herself to stay away from her work. Her laptop remained shut, her notebooks untouched. She spent her time walking through the city, wandering aimlessly as if the movement could quiet her restless mind. But the questions never stopped. They circled her like vultures, waiting to pick apart her resolve. On the 11th day, she found herself back at the clearing where it had all begun. The forest was still, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. She stood in the center of the clearing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared up at the stars. Matt, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of everything she felt. If you're out there, if you can hear me, I'm doing this for you. Her words were carried away by the wind, lost in the vastness of the night. But as she stood there, the doubt that had plagued her began to ease, replaced by a quiet determination. The 21st day arrived, and Lucy woke before dawn, her heart pounding in her chest. She dressed quickly, her movements sharp, purposeful. She didn't know what to expect, didn't know if they would keep their promise. But she was ready to face whatever came next. As the first light of morning broke over the horizon, she stood at her window, her hands gripping the sill tightly. She watched the city come alive, the streets below filling with movement and sound. And she waited. Part 7. The Return. The call came early in the morning, just as the sky was softening into pale blues and faint oranges. Lucy had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling from her bed, her thoughts a relentless carousel of hope and doubt. She wasn't expecting the shrill ring of her phone to shatter the quiet, much less the voice on the other end that would upend her world. Ms. Rollins? The voice was gravelly, measured, with the hint of formality that suggested law enforcement. Yes, Lucy said, sitting up so quickly the blankets tangled around her legs. There was a sharpness to her tone, an urgency she couldn't suppress. My name is Detective Carter. I'm calling from Kansas. We believe we've found someone you'll want to speak with. A Matthew Rollins. He says you're his sister. Lucy froze, her breath catching mid-inhale. The name hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Matt? She said, the word almost fragile, as though saying it aloud might break the spell. Yes, the detective replied. There was a pause, and when he continued, his tone softened. We found him wandering along a highway just outside Wichita. He's unharmed, but he seems disoriented. Says he's been trying to get home. Lucy's heart thundered in her chest, a wild rhythm that drowned out the detective's next few words. She gripped the phone tighter, as though it might anchor her to reality. He's alive? She asked, her voice trembling, a raw mix of disbelief and desperation. He's alive, Carter confirmed, and he's in remarkably good health, but you should come as soon as you can. I'm on my way, she said, already rising from the bed, her movements frantic as she reached for the duffel bag she hadn't unpacked from her last trip. She thanked the detective without hearing his response, ending the call as she stuffed clothes into the bag with trembling hands. The drive to the airport was a blur, her thoughts racing faster than the car speeding down the highway. By the time she boarded the plane, her hands had stopped shaking, but the knot in her stomach remained, a tangled mess of hope, fear, and unrelenting questions. The flight was torturous. Every minute felt stretched to an eternity, the hum of the engines a cruel reminder of her inability to reach him faster. She tried reading, listening to music, anything to quiet her mind, but nothing worked. Her thoughts kept circling back to Matt, what he would look like, what he would say, how it was even possible after 15 years. When Lucy finally arrived at the police station, the sun was beginning to set, casting long streaks of gold across the pavement. Her legs felt heavy as she climbed the steps, her breath hitching with every step closer to the door. Inside, the cool air and muted chatter of officers barely registered. Her eyes scanned the room until she spotted a man leaning against the far wall, his posture relaxed, but his expression guarded. Detective Carter approached her first. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his demeanor one of practiced authority. Ms. Rollins, he greeted, his voice steady but with an undertone of compassion. Thank you for coming so quickly. Where is he? Lucy asked, her voice tight, every syllable laden with urgency. Carter stepped aside, gesturing toward the man she had noticed earlier. He's right here. Lucy's gaze shifted, and the world seemed to tilt as she took him in. Matthew. He was older, of course, but unmistakably him. The same warm brown eyes, the same easy posture, though his hair was shorter now, and his frame was leaner than she remembered. For a moment, she couldn't move, her body rooted to the spot by a wave of emotions so overwhelming they left her breathless. Matt? She said finally, her voice soft, almost uncertain. He turned toward her, his expression flickering with recognition that bloomed into something brighter, something hopeful. Lucy, he said, his voice hoarse, as though testing the name on his tongue. The sound of his voice broke whatever spell had held her in place. She crossed the room in a few quick strides and threw her arms around him, clutching him tightly as if letting go would mean losing him all over again. His arms came around her after a beat, tentative at first, then stronger. You're here, she whispered, her voice shaking, her words tumbling out unbidden. You're alive. I'm here, he said, his tone steady but laced with a quiet confusion. I don't know how, but I'm here. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands gripping his shoulders as though she needed the physical contact to convince herself it wasn't a dream. Do you remember anything? She asked, her voice cracking under the weight of the question. Matt shook his head, his brow creasing. Number it's all blank. 1 minute I was in the clearing with you, and then I don't know. His voice faltered, and he looked away, his hands falling to his sides. It's like I closed my eyes and opened them 15 years later. Lucy swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to push, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He was lost, adrift in a sea of questions she didn't know how to answer. It doesn't matter, she said finally, her tone firm, her words filled with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. You're here now, That's all that matters. Matt nodded, his expression softening as he met her gaze. I've missed you, he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that made her chest ache. She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've missed you too. The drive back to Lucy's apartment was quiet, the silence between them comfortable but charged with unspoken emotions. Matt stared out the window, his gaze distant as he took in the unfamiliar landscape. Lucy stole glances at him whenever she could, her mind cataloging every detail. The way he tilted his head, the faint lines around his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. When they arrived, she led him inside, her movements purposeful as she flicked on the lights and set his bag down by the door. It's not much, but it's home, she said, her voice light, though her chest felt heavy with the weight of everything she wanted to say. Matt smiled faintly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. It's perfect. She gestured toward the couch. Sit. You must be exhausted. I'll get you something to eat. He hesitated, then nodded, sinking into the cushions as though they might swallow him whole. Lucy busied herself in the kitchen, the rhythmic clatter of plates and utensils grounding her in the moment. When she returned with a plate of sandwiches and a cup of tea, Matt was staring at a framed photo on the coffee table, a picture of them as kids, arms slung around each other, grinning at the camera. Where was this taken? He asked, his voice soft, almost wistful. Dad's old cabin, Lucy replied, setting the plate down in front of him. We spent the whole summer there that year. You caught a fish with your bare hands and wouldn't stop bragging about it. Matt chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. I think I remember that. He looked up at her, his eyes searching. How did you keep going? After I disappeared? Lucy sat down beside him, her expression clouding. It wasn't easy, she admitted, her voice low, her words slow and deliberate. I spent years trying to figure out what happened, trying to make sense of it. But I never gave up on you, Matt. Not for a second. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his lap. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his tone filled with a guilt she didn't understand. Don't, she said quickly, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. This wasn't your fault. Whatever happened, it's over now. You're home. Matt looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. Thank you, he said simply, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Lucy smiled, her grip on his arm tightening slightly. Always. The days that followed were a blur of small, quiet moments as Lucy and Matt settled into a new rhythm. She helped him navigate the unfamiliar world he had returned to, answering his questions and easing him into the life he had missed. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about their childhood and filling in the gaps left by the years apart. There were moments of laughter, moments of tears, and moments of silence that spoke volumes. Lucy cherished every one of them, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie, Matt turned to her, his expression thoughtful. Do you think we'll ever figure out what happened? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. Lucy met his gaze, her own eyes soft. Maybe, she said, her tone filled with a quiet hope. But right now, all that matters is that you're here. Matt nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Yeah, I think you're right. Part 8. Closing the chapter, or not. Lucy sat at her desk, staring at the draft of the statement on her laptop. The words blurred as her mind wandered, each line pressing heavier against her chest. Outside the window, the afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting striped patterns across the walls of her modest office. The silence in the room was broken only by the faint hum of the computer and the soft rustling of leaves outside. The statement was simple, deliberately so. It endorsed the mainstream redshift theory without hesitation, carefully worded to suggest a shift in her professional focus while avoiding any outright dismissal of her past work. Lucy had written it knowing it would effectively bury years of effort, but the decision had been made. She owed Matt her attention now, and she didn't want to risk drawing more eyes to her or her family. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she finally pressed send. The email disappeared into cyberspace, and with it, the last lingering traces of her once-consuming pursuit. Lucy leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as she rubbed her temples. A sense of finality settled over her, heavier than she had anticipated. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf, where a collection of her research journals stood in neat rows, untouched for weeks. She had stopped reaching for them, stopped flipping through the pages for answers. The questions they contained had become quieter, almost muted, as if time itself had dulled their urgency. That evening, the sky was clear, a blanket of stars stretching from horizon to horizon. Lucy and Matt had driven to the clearing, the same one where their story had begun so many years ago. It felt surreal to be back, standing on the patch of grass that had once been their sanctuary, and, later, the site of her deepest grief. Matt sat cross-legged on a blanket, his head tilted back as he gazed up at the stars. Lucy stood nearby, her hands in her jacket pockets, watching him with quiet contentment. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of the forest, and the faint chirping of crickets punctuated the silence. "Do you ever feel like they're watching us?" Matt asked suddenly, his voice soft but laced with curiosity. He didn't take his eyes off the sky. Lucy glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "The stars?" "Yeah," he said, turning his head to look at her. "Like they know more than we do. Like they're keeping secrets." She chuckled quietly, her breath visible in the cool air. "They've been around long enough. I guess they've seen everything." Matt smiled at her response, but his gaze returned to the sky, searching its infinite expanse. Lucy walked over and sat beside him, the blanket rustling beneath her as she settled in. The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, the stars above casting a faint silver glow across the clearing. Lucy tilted her head back, letting her eyes trace the constellations she had memorized so long ago. The patterns felt both familiar and distant, like a song she hadn't sung in years. She thought about everything that had brought her here, every sleepless night, every theory scribbled into the margins of her notebooks, every moment spent chasing answers that seemed just out of reach. It all felt smaller now, like a chapter she had closed, its pages folded neatly behind her. "You know," Matt said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts, "I don't remember much about what happened, but I know I felt safe, wherever I was." Lucy turned to look at him, her heart tightening at the vulnerability in his expression. "Safe?" she asked, her voice gentle, her tone encouraging him to continue. Matt nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "It's hard to explain, like being wrapped up in something warm and familiar, even though I knew it wasn't home. Does that make sense?" "It does," Lucy said softly. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "Whatever happened, you're here now. That's what matters." He smiled, his gratitude unspoken but evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. They returned their focus to the sky, the quiet stretching between them again, but this time it felt lighter, more peaceful. As the night deepened, Lucy lay back on the blanket, her arms crossed behind her head. The stars seemed closer now, their light brighter and more vivid against the inky blackness. She felt a sense of stillness settle over her, a calm she hadn't known in years. The questions that had once consumed her felt distant, like whispers carried away by the wind. "Do you ever miss it?" Matt asked, his voice breaking the silence. "The research, I mean. Chasing whatever it was you were looking for?" Lucy hesitated, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I think I'll always wonder," she admitted, her tone thoughtful. "But I don't need to chase it anymore. Not when I've found what matters." Matt turned his head to look at her, his expression soft. "You did it for me, didn't you?" Lucy glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Of course I did. You're my brother. I wasn't going to stop until I got you back." He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. Gratitude, love, and something deeper, an understanding of just how much she had sacrificed for him. As the hours slipped by, the air grew cooler, and Lucy shivered slightly, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Matt noticed and gestured toward the car. "We should probably head back. It's getting late." Lucy nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, she sat up slowly, her gaze lingering on the stars. She felt a quiet ache in her chest, not of sadness, but of something more profound, a sense of closure she hadn't expected. "You gave him back," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely disturbed the stillness around them. Her tone carried a mix of gratitude and finality, as if she were speaking to the universe itself. "That's enough." Matt didn't hear her words, but he stood and offered her a hand, helping her to her feet. They packed up the blanket and walked to the car, their steps unhurried, the clearing behind them fading into the darkness. As they reached the car, Lucy paused, her hand on the door handle. Something in the distance caught her eye, a faint flicker of red light, barely perceptible against the horizon. She froze, her breath catching as she stared at it. The light pulsed once, then disappeared, leaving only the familiar black of the forest beyond. "Lucy?" Matt asked, his tone curious but calm. "You okay?" She blinked, shaking her head as if to clear it. "Yeah," she said, her voice light, her expression softening into a faint smile. "I'm fine." Matt shrugged and climbed into the car, but Lucy lingered for a moment longer. The memory of the red light burned in her mind, but she chose not to dwell on it. Instead, she slipped into the driver's seat, started the car, and turned onto the winding road that would take them home. As they drove away, the stars overhead seemed to shimmer brighter, their ancient light unyielding in its steady brilliance. Lucy kept her eyes on the road, her thoughts quiet, the flicker of red already fading into memory. The end.